Hello everyone, it's Madison and welcome back to your tutorial for Psych 201W for the summer semester and specifically for sections 105 and 106. This is tutorial 2 and we're going to be talking today about how to perform a literature search and write a literature review. So we have a lot of content to cover today, so let's get started. Okay, so the goals of this tutorial include a really quick review of assignment 1. I just have a little bit of feedback for you based on what I observed while I was looking through and marking all of the submissions. And next, we'll cover familiarization with the basics of database searches via the SFU library, and in particular, the database PsycInfo, which psychology students very often use throughout their university education. We'll talk about instruction on general principles of effective searching, and then you've found some relevant articles. Now what? How to write a strong literature review will be the sort of second section of our tutorial today. Okay, so just as mentioned in the tutorial outline, I have a couple things to say about assignment 1 before we move on to the content of this tutorial. And this is feedback that I'll urge you to consider when choosing your research question for this week's assignment, and you'll see what I mean later on. First of all, well done. Almost everyone submitted something, which is great, and everyone who submitted had some great ideas that definitely fell under the psychology umbrella. For those who didn't submit anything, I really urge you to consider submitting something for this coming week and all subsequent weeks. This is just because weekly assignments are worth a combined total of 20% of your grade, which is a lot, and they are relatively easy marks to obtain. Okay, now almost all students specified a clear dependent or outcome variable in each of their 3 possible research questions, but quite a few questions needed to be strengthened by identifying a specific independent variable. So I'll illustrate what I mean by this. If you're interested in a specific outcome, which is your dependent variable, it's really easy to say something like, what exactly leads to this, or what's associated with this? An example is that a couple of you were interested in various questions relating to the pandemic, and one question that emerged somewhat frequently was around mask wearing. A research question without a specified independent variable would look something like this. What factors are associated with individuals refusing to wear masks during the COVID-19 pandemic? The outcome or dependent variable, which is frequency of mask wearing, is clear and it definitely could be operationalized. But you see, what the factors could be is not quite clear just from that sentence alone. So a better and more specific question needs to choose one or technically multiple, but for this purpose, of your research project, I would highly recommend just choosing one independent variable and then examining its relationship to mask wearing frequency. So, for example, the question could be reworked to say this: is respect for authority associated with individuals refusing to wear masks during the COVID-19 pandemic, with respect for authority being your independent variable? Now, I just want to qualify that this is not always the case in published research studies, as many studies examine the relationship of a whole host of independent variables and one or even more dependent variables, and perform complex statistics to really elucidate the association and see which independent variables are related to the dependent variables and which are not. However, this is much beyond the scope of your 201 project, so you all should think clearly or clearly identify an independent variable that you are hoping to study and determine its relationship to your dependent or outcome variable. So getting into the actual content for today's tutorial, the first portion of it will focus on conducting library database research. So in other words, actually finding the literature that you will then include in your literature review. So the material in this presentation will get you started and technically will be sufficient for the purposes of this course. However, this material has been adapted from the library tutorial called Beyond the Basics, Library Research Skills Tutorial. So feel free to check that out at that link on the slide. And I will send these slides around probably Thursday of this week. So you'll be able to copy and paste that directly into your browser. And this tutorial is, the library tutorial that is more comprehensive than this presentation will be. So I do encourage you to check it out if you're wanting more information and guidance at the end of this tutorial. And if you're stuck, there are various resources available through the library to help you out more. So you can always connect with any librarian via the library's website to get started, and you can seek help from that librarian that has been specifically assigned to the psychology department too. So they have a pretty good knowledge and understanding of various research topics in psychology. If you're seeking help with writing skills specifically, the Student Learning Commons is also a fantastic and underutilized resource that can provide feedback on various sections of course assignments or term papers and make suggestions on how to improve your writing, as well as discuss study strategies with you and other things like that. Okay. So now to navigate to the PsycInfo database, you should first Google SFU Library. And then once you're on the library's search engine page, which should look like what's up on the slide right now, you would type PsycInfo into the search bar. So once you search that, you'll find the result that you're looking for right at the top of the left-hand side of the screen. So just click that link and enter in your student credentials if it prompts you to, and then you're in there. Just as a note, you can also search directly on the library's search engine. So that's what you just typed PsycInfo into on the slide before. And it is recommended for classes that are more interdisciplinary, so multiple databases can be accessed within one singular search. However, for the sake of this class, which is very psychology focused, and considering the options that the PsycInfo database search engine gives you, which will be a prominent focus of this tutorial, I would highly recommend doing the search on PsycInfo itself, not on this library database page here. Okay, so once you've clicked on that PsycInfo link on the left-hand side, you'll see a page that looks somewhat like this. And make sure at the top there where it says searching APA PsycInfo, make sure you can see that as well, because if you can't, that means you're searching a different database. So when you search, this database allows you to select what field you're interested in. If you want to search keywords, you can leave it on the default select a field, which you can see it's on right now on the picture that you're seeing. But if you're looking for a specific author or publication year, etc., you can select those options too. Or you can only search the title words or words in the abstract or a lot of other things. You're also able to select if you're looking for multiple keywords using the and or if you're wanting to exclude some specific keywords using the not option that is circled on the slide there. You might be asking, why would you want to exclude keywords? Don't you want to just be as comprehensive as possible? Well, imagine that you're wanting to conduct a search on, say, psychopathy, and you want to include the words psychopathy, psychopath, psychopathic, etc. So you use the base of the word, which is psychopath with the asterisk. We'll discuss that more in depth later. And as I just said, you put an asterisk beside after it, and this indicates that it will pick up any keyword that has the same base root. But guess what other word has the exact same root? Psychopathology, which can refer to pretty much any mental illness. So this will give you way too many results. So what you can do to avoid picking up thousands of results or even hundreds of thousands of results that could give you if it's searching psychopathology as well is to specify not psychopathology as it's showing on the screen there. And then the search engine will exclude that keyword. So you can just enter regular old text in the search bar in PsycInfo, just like you would while doing a Google search, and you can find lots of stuff. But if you really want to more quickly and efficiently find something that's even a bit more specific, you should consider using a really funny term that's called Boolean operators. And we did just a little bit of this with the psychopath, not psychopathy, or not psychopathology search right now, but let's discuss it a little bit more. So let's say I'm now interested in the impact of adolescent cannabis use on academic achievement. I could simply enter cannabis into the first search bar of PsycInfo, and I would get a ton of hits, most of which would not be relevant. Then I'd have to sift through them all, and that would be a big job. I could narrow it down to cannabis and academic achievement, which would no doubt be a bit better, but I could still return a lot of hits that are concerning adults when I'm not interested in that. Narrowing it to cannabis, academic achievement, and adolescent is much better. So we now have it narrowed down. How do we tell the database to do the same thing? Our final search might look something like this, just as plain text. So breaking this down a little bit more, I want studies about cannabis or marijuana regardless of what term they use, because studies could be indexed under either one of those terms. So I use cannabis or marijuana. I also want studies to focus on academic achievement. So I've put the AND search operator between the first two concepts I'm searching for. And I also want studies that are about adolescence. So I then put an AND between the second two concepts as well. Importantly, this whole phrase tells the database that I want a study that is about all three of these concepts, not just one of these topics. But let's think, can we be even more specific here? We probably can. So now we've narrowed it down even further. We've excluded studies that may look at multiple substances such as heroin that we're not interested in. We've quantified academic achievement, which is an abstract concept, into something more tangible like GPA. And in case any studies focus on the latter two topics in adolescents and adults, we've narrowed it down to adolescents only. And now I'll draw your attention to these two little tricks. The asterisk, which we used in the psychopathy search too, is a quote-unquote wildcard operator that gives search results for studies that are using variations on this root term. So in this case, we would be including both adolescents and adolescent without having to put each of the terms manually into the search bar ourselves and just clog it up. Now looking at the quotes around GPA, quotes tell the database to return studies to us that include the language that we're specifying verbatim. So it is possible that other words have the letters GPA contained within them. So we're telling the engine that the keyword must be those three letters in that order and only these three letters. So you can refer back to this slide as a source of information when conducting your literature searches in the future, and especially for your research project in this class. So parentheses, They group terms together so that you can search for both instead of just one or the other. So for example, cannabis and abuse, not just cannabis or abuse, which is what happens if you don't put them in parentheses, and which tells the database you want results for both of the terms you search for, not specifies the term that you do not want to come back, like psychopathology in our psychopath search, or tells the database to return with results related to either of the terms you searched for. The asterisk is a wildcard operator that returns all variations of a root word. So another example here, child with an asterisk would return results with child, childhood, and children. And then the quotation marks tell the database to return results that include the specific terms you've put in quotes and no other variations of them. So to see this in practice actually in the PSYC-Info database, you should first enter the portions of your search terms in each of the search bars. Remember, we're separating each of the ideas/concepts we are searching for by and, so we need each of the 3 search bars to allow us to select the and each time. However, you can also put these Boolean terms in the actual search bar itself. As you can see in the first one, we've put cannabis or marijuana. It'll still pick that up. And as a note, if necessary, you can make more search bars than just the 3 that it generates automatically appear. You just have to click the plus sign on the right hand side of the last select field button, which is highlighted or circled in pink on the screen. So once we click search, it restructures itself a bit, but we don't need to worry about that. It will still have worked. We'll check out the first search result here, and I'll show you a few handy tips and how to actually access articles that don't automatically appear on PSYC-Info. And just a final note on the general search page, on the left-hand side of the screen, which has been isolated here, you can restrict the range of publication years you are searching for. So it's not specifically necessary for this class, I believe at this point, but just an FYI if you need to find articles with certain publication dates in future classes. So now, once we've clicked on that first result, we see a lot of information, like the authors, the page count, the publishers, etc. So often there will be a clear button that's quite obvious that says PDF full text on the left-hand side of the screen, right under the detailed record, which also has a little PDF icon right beside it. And you click on that and you'll get the PDF generated right within PSYC-Info for you, and it's really simple. But what do you do if you don't see that like we have here? So you click on this red button first that's circled, and you'll likely be prompted to enter your SFU credentials on a next page. And if it doesn't take you directly to the full article, it may take you to a page on another website that looks something like this. So you find the download PDF button that's usually somewhere around the top of the page. It's circled in red right here. You click it and the PDF article will generate in another tab. And as one last note, if you go back to the article page in PSYC-Info, there's a really easy way that you can generate a full APA reference for the article. So you just click on the cite option, which is circled in red here on the right-hand side. And then this generates citations for the article in multiple reference styles, and you just have to navigate down to APA format. Of course, you must check this over for all the citations that are generated like this, as sometimes the software can make mistakes and you can't use it as a get out of jail free card if you turn in an assignment and it's not in APA formatting and you get marks taken off. You are expected to check this yourself before you submit anything. But it does save a lot of time and I use it quite frequently. Okay, so that's all for library database searches, and next we'll transition into the second part of the tutorial, which will discuss the actual writing of a literature review after you've found some sources. So what is a literature review generally? It's a summary of published research and it's curated to your topic of focus. The goals of a literature review generally are to provide an overview of the research on a topic, make your reader familiar with the essential concepts of a topic, highlight gaps, contradictions, and limitations in that area of research, and walk your reader into your research question and why it's important. Sometimes the sole purpose of an article is reviewing the extant literature on a specific topic. These types of articles include things like systematic reviews, narrative reviews, and meta-analyses, which you might have heard of or encountered in your classes thus far. These types of literature reviews are very structured and they need to be done a specific way, so we won't discuss them at length right now. However, for more quote-unquote regular articles that report an original piece of research, which your project will be structured after, the lit review will be shorter and more focused. I like to use a funnel analogy when introducing literature reviews. They are meant to start broad and then get narrower, ending with the existing research that is the closest to your research question, and then your research question itself. Specifically, a literature review will introduce your reader to the broad, relevant issues and topics, familiarize your reader to the essential concepts they need to know to understand your study, carve out the space where your study fits, usually by highlighting gaps in the literature, limitations, mixed findings, etc., and then segue naturally into your specific research question. Here's an example. Suppose my research question is, do university students who perform 5 minutes of mindful meditation before an exam experience lower levels of anxiety? So to do a literature review on this topic and prepare readers for my research question, I'd first start with the broad topic of anxiety in university students, then narrow my focus to any existing research that includes the other key concept within my question, which is mindful meditation, and then finally end with any research that in particular includes student use of mindful meditation right before an exam and has some operationalization of anxiety as the dependent variable, just like my study will. So for your research proposal, thinking a little bit ahead, you'll need to find and review a minimum of 5 articles related to your topic, and this will technically be called your introduction section, but it is considered a literature review. We'll walk through the steps on the next slide, and just as a note, yours will be much shorter than a normal lit review, but the process is pretty much the same. And as a bonus, this week's assignment makes you get a big head start on your proposal introduction/literature review, but there will be more on that later. So step 1, you log into PsycInfo and, putting the skills you just learned to good use, find and skim some articles and get a general sense of your topic. Your task is to basically summarize the topic to your readers, so you should be familiar with it yourself. In particular, you're looking at what's the topic an issue? Why is it important? And are there any main theories, methods, techniques, and tools that are essential to know about when you're diving into the literature or research on this topic? So let's construct an example that I'll use throughout the rest of the tutorial to illustrate the process. Let's say I want to conduct a study on treatment for sexual offending, which is quite a broad topic. And then I narrow it, so my particular research question is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, effective in reducing sexual reoffending? So I then jump onto PsycInfo and start reviewing articles to get a sense of just what's out there. And I start to familiarize myself with some key concepts. So after some time spent with the literature, here's what I find. What's my topic and issue? It's CBT of people convicted of sexual offenses. Why is it important? Sexual violence is a disturbingly prevalent phenomenon that has serious costs and consequences for victims, communities, offenders, and society at large. Since most sexual offenders will be released, treatment is important to reduce the risk of reoffense. And are there any main theories, methods, techniques, tools that are essential to know about? This isn't an exhaustive list, but some things are rates of reoffending among sexual offenders, approaches to treating sexual offenders, the actual context of the treatment. So for example, where does it happen? And just some general points on cognitive behavioral therapy itself, so I know I understand it well enough. Next, you find and review studies that have tested questions that are fairly similar to yours. These studies will inform your thinking about your own study, indicate existing gaps in the literature that your study can possibly fill, present certain limitations that you can address, and ultimately give you a strong rationale for your own hypothesis, which is what you really are doing when writing an effective literature review. So, just a quick note on all this, and Dr. Tan discussed it as well in lecture last week briefly. Some research questions in psychology have been studied pretty extensively with well-established findings. Examples of this that are not exhaustive are, is CBT effective for reducing symptoms of anxiety? Yes, generally it is. Does trauma experienced in childhood put a person at higher risk for mental illness? Yes, generally it does. So it's important that you select a topic for your project that may have been researched before. You don't have to go out and find something completely new, because then that's a PhD dissertation. But it can't be fully decided on, or it can't be studied at length. The results should be contentious in previous research, or they should vary across previous studies. So basically, you don't want the quote-unquote gap in the literature you're trying to fill to be as small as the gap between those two cars, because that's pretty small. So going back to our example, step 2 in action would see me looking for prior studies that have looked at the effect of CBT on sexual offending. From these prior studies, I can learn important things, like how researchers that have already looked at this topic measure the constructs I'm hoping to measure, the statistics they use, what type of samples they chose, what outcome variables they chose. So how did they define their outcome variable of sexual reoffending? Did they define it by arrests, convictions? Did they define it by self-report or official criminal records? And how CBT itself was designed and implemented. Third, I would begin to outline my actual intro using the funnel that we've discussed before. So this would include the topic and issue and why it's important to start off with, then some key concepts the reader needs to know, what prior studies have found, and things like where your study fits in, what it will address, and your research question and hypothesis. And of course, these 3 things that are encompassed in part 4 of that are right at the end of your literature review, right before you start getting into the methods and what you did in your own study. So still using the example topic of CBT for sexual offending, this would look like first outlining the costs and scope of sexual violence and the need for treatment. Then you'd move into where treatment happens, why approaches are used or why certain approaches are used, and explaining the cognitive behavioral approach to sex offender treatment. Then you'd look and summarize some prior studies that have found potentially small to moderate effects for CBT-based sex offender treatment. And then right at the very end, you'd write something along the lines of, this study will address a gap by focusing on CPT for offenders convicted of online offenses who have not yet been studied. And the online offenses is maybe a portion of your study that makes it new, novel, filling a gap that hasn't been previously addressed. And then you might say something like, we will examine if CBT is effective in reducing reoffense rates for online offenders. It is hypothesized that CBT will be effective in reducing recidivism. And lastly, for step 4, I would fill out the actual meat of my outline from just the bare bones structure that I discussed previously. I would work on it in chunks and just get anything I could down on the page first, then start to play around with the flow and structure while editing. I know sometimes we all encounter writer's block and we just don't know how to start, so I find it really helpful to just start writing and get something down and then maybe return to it a day or so later and then start to reorganize it and play with structure. Being clear and succinct is also one of the most important skills in research writing. So you always need to be asking yourself, does my reader really need to know this? Is this integral to the funnel structure of my introduction? On that note, brevity is important to consider when writing a literature review. You won't have a tremendous amount of space in your proposal for it, since there will be a page limit, and it is a really important skill to develop as you go on in university. It's arguably just as important to good writing as being able to write a really long paper, and sometimes even more so. Just as an example, I had to submit an application for a major award last year where I had to describe my whole master's thesis, which is like the literature review component of it, the methods I wanted to use, and what the implications of my results might be. And I had to describe this all in one single page. This award was worth over $10,000, so a lot was riding on my ability to write with brevity. Here are some general tips that may go slightly against what you've learned in high school, but are key to writing in university, and particularly research writing in university. So don't dress up sentences, formal writing, of course, but simple and to the point. Don't repeat things, that's just a waste of space. Stick to the essentials, and again, ask, what does my reader need to know? And when reviewing other studies, just hit the highlights, not the small details, and I'll give you a bit of a roadmap for that at the end of the tutorial. So almost all your introduction will be made up of your review of your 5 or more articles. So you need to strike a balance between telling the reader what they need to know about the study without getting lost in the weeds. This requires strong paraphrasing skills, and this is where the APA's dislike of quotes comes into play. So avoid direct quotes unless it's absolutely necessary, and even if you think it's necessary, 9 times out of 10, or maybe even 99 times out of 100, it's usually not. So challenge yourself to not quote, always. And I'll provide a couple suggestions on how I do this, which may or may not be helpful to you. So simply finding a study that relates to your idea is not necessarily enough to warrant summarizing it in your literature review with the tight constraints on space that you have. So the studies reviewed in your introduction should always help set the stage for your study. You should be able to use your studies to guide your reader to your question. So all these studies in some way should address your question as closely as possible, bear upon key concepts that you and your study are concerned with, give you some idea about what to expect when you do your study and talk about your results, and highlight important limitations and or contradictions in the research on the area. So for example, maybe one study didn't find what a lot of other studies found, maybe one study overcame important limitations that all the other studies discussed at the end, something like that. So going back to the example that we've been talking about, In my hypothetical study on sexual offender treatment, the studies I review won't just be any study about treatment or sex offending, because my literature review would be 20+ pages. I want to review literature that specifically is focused on the effectiveness of sexual offender treatment, focused on CBT treatment in particular, if possible. I want to review literature that addresses the special subpopulation of online offenders, because that's what I'm focusing on in my research question, if you remember. And I want to review literature that represents some of the bigger and better studies in the area that are well cited. So there might be a systematic review or a meta-analysis on treatment for sexual offending. That might be a really important one for me to cite, especially if it talks about CBT at some point too. So another good tip is to take notes in your own words from the very start. That way, when writing your notes into your actual paper, you can pull directly from them and use some of the same wording without being worried that you might be plagiarizing. If you copy your notes directly from the paper, or maybe even just copy some of your notes and put some other or some more of them in your own words, you're always going to be wondering, oh, is this the part that I copied or not? And you'll never know if you're able to use it directly. So this just saves some time. When taking down notes, you want to include the study's research question, the sample or setting that they conducted their research in, or the participants and the characteristics of them, their design and materials, their main findings, and their key limitations. So one thing that I've done in the past and others have done is to make an Excel sheet and take those 5 things that you want to make note of, or maybe even break them down a little bit more, and make them separate columns of your Excel sheet. And then in the rows, list each of the studies that you're surveying. So that's a really comprehensive and almost systematic way of collecting information for your literature review, but of course you can just write notes on a piece of paper or a Word document too. And lastly, remember that copying and pasting directly from the article into your paper itself is plagiarizing and does come with serious consequences. So even for your weekly assignments, this is not permitted. So just be really careful about this and just always make sure it's in your own words. You want to look for studies as similar as possible to what you plan to do. These are the best possible comparisons, and their results should give you the best idea about what to expect. If there are studies that contradict your hypothesis, it's important to highlight these as well. It's intellectually honest and lets your reader know that there is an unresolved question in the field. So you might be thinking, oh no, their literature is all over the place about my question, what do I do now? But this is actually good, as it's an indication that you're not just asking a research question, like I discussed previously, that's just been put to bed already. If there's contention around it, that makes your study necessary. Also pay attention to what studies are being cited. So if you see the same study showing up again and again in a lot of papers, it might be really good and influential, and you can track it down and potentially use it yourself too. So when summarizing, you always want to practice brevity. You want to describe the study in about a paragraph, so roughly 3 to 6 sentences, give or take one, and not much more than that. You want to ask, what's important about this study for my reader to know? What's my goal in citing this paper? Does it help give background and set the stage for my study? If the answer to those questions is no, I would consider not including it and potentially going to find another study that is better suited to your research question. As a general rule of thumb, you should include what the research question of the study was, of course, in your own words, and often paraphrasing it to make it shorter. The sample, so the number of subjects, the setting, are they offenders in inmate correctional situation? Are they forensic psychiatric inpatients? Are they just general members of the community? Different things like that. the design of the experiment and briefly note the conditions or stimuli used if it's a true experiment, the main results of the study, and key limitations of the study, especially if it's applicable to your research question. So if you are building on them or addressing a limitation of existing research. So hitting those 5 highlights is fairly easy to do in the 3 to 6 sentences I recommended keeping the description of each study too. Okay, so that brings us to the end of tutorial 2 and the instructions for your second assignment. So first, select one of the examples you described last week or choose a new one if you want. Describe it very briefly, just a couple of sentences, and this can be copied and pasted from your assignment last week if you're satisfied with your wording and if it isn't choppy and it flows nicely into the new stuff that you're writing this week. So of course, if you just kind of got something down on paper and didn't really think about your wording, or you might want to refine your question more, considering the feedback I gave at the start of this tutorial, you might want to revise it a little bit. Next, you should perform a literature search and find 5 articles that address the research question that you've described. You'll want to read and summarize at least 3 of the 5 with a focus on how they address your research question, and that's very key. So don't just find 5 or 3 to 5 random studies that only tangentially are associated with your research question, because I will see that, and that could potentially make you lose marks. Now, remember when I said that you didn't have to choose one of the examples you used last week for your project? This still stands, and technically you could do this assignment on one research question and then totally switch focus and do something else for your research project, and that's fine. But this week, I really do urge you to figure out what general topic you'd like to do your research project on and use it for this assignment. While the 5 studies you find today don't have to actually be used for your 5 in your actual proposal, so I know that you are having to do this in 24 hours, it might be a bit rushed, and when you're writing your actual proposal, you can probably do a deeper dive into the extant literature than you are doing today. So you can think of this as more of a practice run. But I'm sure at least a couple of these studies that you find today could be used in your actual proposal if you stick with the same topic. So it really is just saving yourself work if you choose to do it now, or choose to figure out your topic now and use it for the rest of the course. Of course, as mentioned before, you must use your own words in any assignments that plagiarize. Others' material will be given an automatic 0. While the formatting for this assignment doesn't have to be perfect because you're not being marked directly on it, you do need to try your hand at in-text citations, and you do need to include a reference page in APA format. So you should do or give all of this a trial run here. This assignment should be no longer than 3 pages, and this is a hard limit. So this means 2 double-spaced pages of content and 1 reference page. And that's all. So of course, I'll be online on Zoom from 10 to 11 today if you have any questions about this. And I really recommend that you get started on your weekly assignment right away, because it is one that's going to take a little bit more work than last week's. Have a good rest of your day, everybody.